On Tuesday, August 30th, Magnus Carlsen logged into Chess.com and played an epic 57-game match against Big Fish 1995, aka Vladimir Fedoseev. Partway through, it became apparent to spectators that Carlsen had a clear goal in mind, the #1 rating on the Chess.com Blitz Leaderboard. Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura held the #1 spot with an even 3,200, and that same day, probably not coincidentally, Hikaru had an incredible run in the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, gaining around 40 Blitz points and claiming clear first on the official FIDE Blitz rating list by a wide margin. Initially, Fedoseev scored well against Carlsen, but as the number of games grew, Carlsen's edge became more apparent. Still, with every win, Carlsen would gain only a handful of points, while losses and even draws set him back significantly. As dawn approached in Norway, Carlsen broke through, first tying Nakamura's mark with 3,200 exactly, and then with one more win, hitting 3,204 and claiming clear first on the leaderboard. Carlsen had made one previous attempt to top the leaderboard back in 2020 on a semi-anonymous account, and Fedoseev had been one of the stiff defenders who held him off at that time. One of my personal favorite moments was the following incredible swindle that even had Carlsen laughing.
And my b-pawn is not like magically... Oh my. Oh, I just assumed he would take the...
Just last week, Chess.com announced an offer to acquire Play Magnus. The offer has been unanimously accepted by the Play Magnus board, although the process is pending. Fans naturally hope to see Magnus in more events and matches such as this one on Chess.com, and Magnus himself spoke to that in the announcement video.
I'm excited to play in the Speed Chess Championship again. I have a score to settle, obviously, after the last time I played and lost in the semifinals. But generally, just happy to be playing top level events on a regular basis.
The following game, the 49th, was probably the most memorable of the match. Carlsen plays down an entire rook, but showcases the power of the bishop pair and passed pawns and ultimately wins with a spectacular and very pretty finish. Magnus opens the game here with on c4, we get c5, knight f3, g6, and d4, bishop g7, and pawn to d5. So right out of the gate, we're getting an imbalance here with this big pawn center for Magnus. Actually, this is an imbalance that Magnus and Fedoseev have played with before. In fact, this imbalance existed in both of their 2021 World Cup games. So Magnus and Fedoseev have played each side of this kind of pawn structure, and actually Magnus won both of those games, and they were two of the most brilliant games in that particular World Cup. So here we now get pawn to d6, e4, bishop g4, pinning the knight, and bishop d3, which is maybe a little bit odd because you're allowing this pin to persist and opening up to the possibility of knight to d7 and then knight to e5, which will gain a tempo on the bishop and will be a little more effective than if the bishop was on e2, which is more popular. So now we get knight to d7, knight to d2, and in this position, knight e5 makes a lot of sense. White's going to get an advantage after this move, but it will lead to some trades, and black is going to be down in space, so getting more pieces off the board is generally in black's interest when there's less space. But instead, we get pawn to a6, and now h3, and one last chance. You can play knight e5 here, even though your bishop was just attacked, because knight e5 will attack this loose bishop on d3. And the computer definitely thinks that at this point, knight e5 was the best idea. So bishop takes f3 instead, though. We're going to get an imbalance with the bishop pair against the knights. It's going to be important in this game. And now knight takes f3, pawn to b5. Now, often white really isn't in a position to take this too advantageously anyway because of positional pressure. You can think of the Bimco gambit. But here, white actually just doesn't want to go and capture this because if you do bishop takes b5, there's queen a5 check, which would be a blunder that Magnus Carlsen is just never going to make. So instead, after pawn to b5, white goes ahead and castles, and now we get knight to f6, and rook to e1, rook to b8, so black is supporting the b-pawn, and also opening up for some pressure here against b2 at some point if things go well for Fedoseev. So we get rook to b1, and here castles, bishop to d2, and knight to e8. This move might kind of surprise someone who's new to chess. Why would you move your knight back to the edge of the board? It's not being attacked or anything, but knight e8 is very, very common in these kinds of positions. The knight does like to go to c7, where it can support this pawn structure right here. Sometimes, if black gets good counterplay against the center, it can pressure d5, support pawn e6, and of course the knight's retreat opens up the bishop here to attack b2 and just have, lots of room to roam on the long diagonal. Here is a really, really nice move from Magnus. Pawn to b4. I think a lot of newer players would be very, very reluctant to kind of open up the queen side when it looks like black is trying to create pressure there and black has more pawns, in a good, strong position on the queen side at the moment. But actually, b4 is just a really great move that's opening up things, and we see that white actually has a lot of pieces in position to take advantage of the queenside structure, and this is, creating more lines for the bishops, which white, of course, loves as well. So one interesting move the computer points out here, by the way, was to meet this, advance that creates this enormous pawn tension with more pawn tension. Black could have played pawn to a5 here, which is one of the computer's favorite moves. If you capture over here, black can advance b4, and white still certainly has an advantage, but black gets a good pawn structure in a lot of these lines. So a5 is a move that I really like on a positional level. Instead, though, we get b4 and then c takes b4 from Fedoseev, who now has the c5 square for his knight. And pawn takes on b5, knight c5, gaining a tempo on the bishop, which falls all the way back here to f1, and pawn to a5. So dream scenario for Fedoseev now is you're able to go and win this pawn right here. You've got good pawns on a5 and b4. Your knight on c5 is great. If you get all of that, then you're doing amazingly, and black is much better. Which is why Magnus now senses that there is an opportunity and time is of the essence, and he opens things up with pawn to e5, which is the best move in the position and a really, really strong move right here. So after pawn to e5, we get pawn takes on e5, knight takes on e5. Now, Fedoseev cannot play queen takes d5. It might look like that move is just fantastic, but in fact here, there's knight c6. You attack the rook, and you also threaten this fork on e7, a fork of the queen and the king, and so white would just win an exchange in this particular line. So after knight takes e5, we get bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, knight to d6. The knights are looking pretty good, although bishop pairs are very strong, as we'll see in this game. Bishop to h6, attacking the rook, which now moves over to e8. And in this position, the computer is saying you have to play something like rook c1 if you want to maintain the advantage. That's how sharp the position is. Instead, the natural move queen d4 allows Fedoseev to get a pretty good position, although the play is by no means simple. Here, pawn to f6. Of course, you really need to shut down this diagonal right here, because if you leave it open, there's all kinds of moves like rook takes e7 that would allow checkmate here if the queen could come in this direction. So we get pawn f6, the rook is pushed back, it falls back to e1, and the best move and the best opportunity Fedoseev had in this game would now be knight to a4, moving the attacked knight over to the edge of the board, but intending to reintroduce it here on c3, where it would attack the rook, this pawn on a2, and the b5 pawn, and the d5 pawn. So knight a4 in this position is just perfect. Put that knight on c3 and attack all of the sensitive points in the position for white. But after queen b6 here, instead, Magnus now gets a really, really good opportunity with bishop e3, lining up and pinning the knight here. Now, the computer says Fedoseev needs to be passive and play a move like rook c8, rook ec8, or rook bc8 to support the attack knight on c5. But that's really passive. It's hard to play. Fedoseev is an aggressive player. He now tries the move knight a4. Unfortunately, it's a move later than the computer thought he should play this move, and now queen d1 is really strong by Magnus. He senses that he can create this double attack, hitting the queen and hitting the knight. As a result, Fedoseev only has the try here knight c3, meeting an attack on his queen with an attack on Magnus's queen on d1, and also forking the rook on b1. Bishop takes b6. Magnus goes ahead and takes Fedoseev's queen. Fedoseev takes Magnus's queen. The attacked bishop here now picks off a pawn. Bishop takes a5 and knight c3. Now, at this point, Magnus makes maybe the one mistake that he makes in this game, but I think he knew the best move and he just wanted to play the fun move, the flashy move, which is fantastic. As a chess fan, we want to see chess players play who are trying to entertain as much as they are trying to win. So the simple move here is just play rook takes b4, and you pick up the b4 pawn. And in this position, basically white is just winning. White is up material. White has the bishop pair, and the computer says that this is like +5 if you let it think for a while. Instead, Magnus goes down a path where he's actually going to sacrifice a rook. He plays bishop takes b4. And by the way, he's still really close to winning in this line, maybe winning with best play, but it's much more complicated. So he's giving Fedoseev the opportunity to play knight takes b1 right here. And in this position, of course, his goal is not to just recapture on b1. That would allow Fedoseev to pick off the pawn on b5, and then Fedoseev would actually be doing great. Instead, his point is pawn to a4. Boom. These are connected passed pawns. But Magnus just resisted the opportunity to recapture the knight, and he's had his rook captured on b1. So he's sacrificed a rook with this move right here. The point is, he's trying to pick up the knight here on b1, which is trapped by this beautiful bishop here that just dominates the knight. And then he wants to maintain these amazing connected passed pawns. If he has connected passed pawns and the bishop pair, he's just going to win very easily here. But Fedoseev has resources. So he plays rook a8, attacking this pawn on a4. If he can get rid of that pawn, then the pawns are much weaker than they would be before. And it's okay to give up the knight that is trapped if you can get this pawn right here. So Magnus plays pawn to a5, really trying to keep the connected passed pawns. Rook to b8, so he's threatening, Fedoseev is threatening this pawn on b5. Pawn to b6. And in this position, knight to a3, which is a really great move from Fedoseev. This move says, hey, you got to capture my knight at some point, right? And now when you capture my knight, I'm going to take not just this a5 pawn, I'm also going to get the b6 pawn in a moment. And actually, you're just down an exchange. And, black is actually much, much better. So Magnus, in this position, has no intention of taking the knight on a3. Instead, he's going to stay down a rook. He plays rook takes e7. Now this rook is dominating the 7th rank. He keeps the connected passed pawns, and he also manages to fork Fedoseev's knights, which is, really, really unique. How often can you see a scenario where a bishop is forking 2 knights like this? It's a really beautiful situation. And for all of these beautiful things in the position, Magnus has only had to continue to stay down a rook in the position. So here, the knights are forked, and the knights must defend each other. The correct way for the knights to defend each other, according to the chess engine, was here to go knight ac4, pulling the knight back from the edge of the board where it's been stuck. The knights are now defending each other. There's pressure here on a5, and this position is super complicated. It's still better for Magnus, but the computer says that Fedoseev can defend here. And I'm going to give a crazy computer line here. It goes rook e6, so putting pressure on the d6 knight. And in this position, we have rook over to d8, bishop takes c4, knight takes c4. Magnus is still down a rook, but with 3 passed pawns. And now we get pawn to b7, attacking the rook, at which point black has to desperately try to give back material to break apart white's threats, and white continues to not accept the material. Rook takes a5 here, and then instead of capturing this and then the knight captures and the pawns are dealt with, we have rook c6 hitting the knight and intending rook c6 and also keeping this rook under attack. And then rook b5, leaving the knight hanging, but counterattacking this bishop down here. Rook c8, leaving everything hanging, but hitting this rook and trying to promote this pawn on b7. And now we get rook takes b7, rook takes d8 check, king f7. This is where the computer line ends. And white still has an extra pawn in this position, but it's very likely that this pawn is going to fall because black's king is a little bit too close to it. It's a bit isolated and difficult to support. And this position is more likely to be a draw than anything else. But all of that was super complicated. This is a 3-0 blitz game. Of course, we're not expecting either player to see these crazy computer lines. And in the game, Fedoseev misses this computer chance. He plays knight dc4. So the knights defend each other, but in a bit of a worse fashion. Maybe Fedoseev was thinking that, my knight here is on the rim, but on the other hand, it's harder to attack the knights when they're defending each other over here. Whereas when I had them defending each other in this position, then they could be undermined a little more easily. So they can't really be undermined or attacked quite as effectively in this position, but it doesn't matter because Magnus now just dominates the board and he doesn't need to go after the knights. So we get pawn to d6. This pawn is pushing forward. Now, this is kind of the last moment as black that you're just going to try and spend all your time and see, is there any defense here? But there really isn't. The computer says this is winning for white. If you try a move like h5, which doesn't do anything, but just to put like a passing move on the board that says, hey, how do you beat me? White can just play pawn to d7. And in this position, black isn't able to move the king. Black isn't able to do anything productive with the rooks. The knights are stuck defending each other. And basically, it's like Zugzwang right here. Down a rook and not really in possession of an immediate threat. White is just winning because black is just totally stuck for moves. In the game, we got a spectacular finish. And it goes knight takes on a5. Right, trying to get rid of those passed pawns over on the queen side. Bishop takes on a3, so Magnus has finally regained some material. Knight to c6, attacking the rook on e7, but now bishop to c4 check. The king tries to hide over on h8, and now bishop to b2. Very, very pretty. So the bishop b2 move right here is offering up the rook. The rook can be captured. But after knight takes e7, it's actually this checkmate here on the board with bishop takes mate. So we have this beautiful bishop checkmate that features in the remaining lines. So after bishop b2, instead of taking the rook, Fedoseev tries knight to e5, trying to blunt the attack on this diagonal, the threat of bishop takes f6 with mate. But Magnus just plays rook takes e5, same idea. Now if you play pawn takes, bishop takes, oh, what a way to finish, right? Magnus has been relying on the strength of the bishops all game long. So to finish with this checkmate is amazing. And he is going to get that checkmate basically in. After rook takes b6, Magnus has the rook and the bishop under attack. But he plays rook to e8 check, which got a brilliant annotation from Game Review. So he sacrifices the rook to open up the bishop to take f6. And Fedoseev resigned here, but of course, at this point, the finish is forced. Rook takes, and then bishop takes. Actually, black could move the king, but then you lose the rook on a8. So the checkmate is really kind of the most direct main line. Amazing, amazing stuff from Magnus. If you like this video, you will probably also love this other video about an amazing Magnus Carlsen Blitz game. Actually, in that game, he does come out on the worst side, but he is an incredible sport about it, and the game ultimately won the Chess.com Immortal Game Prize.